Midpoint. Before we even talk about formula, what does midpoint mean to you? The middle, right? Midpoint is in the middle. It is a point in the middle. So if I have a line segment, for instance, the point directly in the middle is going to be my midpoint. We agree with that? Okay. Does anyone know what these points are called? Endpoints. Good. This is an endpoint and an endpoint. Now, if we're talking about this line segment, we have two endpoints and a midpoint. Is there anything you can tell me about this segment? You can be general. You can throw out numbers to try to be specific. What do you know about this segment? What could you tell me? Anything? You have a point in the middle. Is there anything you could tell me about this segment? Annie? Both sides are equal. Do you mean like from the endpoint to the midpoint and the midpoint to the endpoint? So both of these sides have to be equal if there's a point in the middle. Okay, so they're congruent. Do you remember these marks called tick marks to show something's congruent? Yes. Okay, so if my entire segment is, let's say, 10. My entire segment is 10 yards. We're just going to throw in some units. If my entire segment is 10 yards, what are each of these segments? 5. Okay. Because each segment has to be equal. If the whole thing is 10, each of them is 5. We're okay with that? Okay, I would like you to take 30 seconds-ish and see if you and your group can come up with the midpoint formula. There's a midpoint formula. See if you remember it because you learned it last year.
Y2 divided by 2, then another parentheses, x1 plus x2 divided by 2.
You're super close. Okay? So, if it's a midpoint, a key word in there is point, right? It's actually going to be a point. So it's going to be an XY coordinate. When you solve, you're going to have an XY coordinate. Everyone okay with that? So what comes first in a coordinate? The x's. So MJ was close, super, super close. The x's are going to come first. So x2 plus x1 divided by 2. And then y2 plus y1 divided by 2.
Now, so there's no debate in the middle of a problem. Does it matter? We're adding. Does it matter which x we add first?
Nope.
No, just x is together divided by 2, y is together divided by 2.
Why do you think we're dividing by 2? Because it has two parts. We're looking at the middle point, right? And both of those parts are going to be the same. So if you're looking at the distance from the first x to the second x, that's great. That's the whole segment, but you want the middle, which is why we're dividing by 2. Okay? So let's just try a couple. We're going to find the midpoint. Let's look at the points -4, 6, and -5, -8. Now, what would your super smart, brilliant teacher tell you to do first?
Label it.
Oh, see, y'all are super smart and brilliant too. Label your points. X1, Y1, X2, Y2. Because if you label your points, you are less likely to screw it up. I promise you that. Then it's plugging it into the formula. And we're going to look at this a couple different ways, but it's plugging it into the formula. So I'm searching for a point. It's going to be my X and Y. And when I plug it in, I have -5 plus -4 divided by 2. And I have -8 plus 6 divided by 2. So I'm adding the y's and I'm adding the x's. -5 plus a -4. -9 and -9 divided by 2. We can write in two ways. I will take -9 over 2. If we have to graph it, it's probably best to make it a decimal. And what would it be as a decimal? -4.5. So I'll take either one. And then -8 plus 6. -8 plus 6. -2 divided by 2. -1. So I will take either of those two. Okay, either one is fine. So this is normally where I would stop unless for some reason I have to graph it, and then I would write it as a decimal. But again, either is fine. We remember this from last year? Awesome. No? Some of us not so much? Do you want to try another one together? Yes? Okay. How about -9, -6, and -9, -5? So step 1 is going to be to label. And then plug it in. So I have -9 plus -9 divided by 2, and -5 plus -6 divided by 2. -9 plus a -9, -18, and -18 divided by 2, -9. -5 plus a -6, -11. Let's just go ahead and make that a decimal. What's -11 divided by 2? What is it? -5.5. So if you were to draw a line segment, these points would be that middle point between those two endpoints. Okay, I'm going to give you one. I might be throwing a curveball at you, but I have faith that you can do it. And as soon as it pops on, I'm sure Mr. Garza is going to see exactly what that curveball is. If my hand wasn't in the way, look at this. Try again. It's going to be magic. Ready? And it's there. There we go. Oh, didn't even write it. It's magic. Okay, I want you to try this with your group.
Oh, you're nice. I thought you were.
Step 1, label my points. Step 2, plug it in. So 5 plus a -5 over 2, and 6 plus 4 over 2. 5 plus -5.
0.
And 0 divided by 2?
0.
Good job. 6 plus 4 is 10. 10 divided by 2? 5. So the big things are making sure that you put X and Y in the right spot, right? And know that 0 is a number, so it's allowed to be there. I mean, you can have $0 in your bank account. You wouldn't be happy, but it could happen. Okay? Are we okay with that? Here's the fun part.
Good.
I love how they throw out fraction, decimal. How about find the endpoint? Oh, this is easy. Okay. So if I'm searching for the endpoint, what do I already know? Okay. So not everyone heard my question, I don't think. So if I'm searching for an endpoint, what information do I already know? I know the midpoint and the other endpoint. Now, I could give you 2 points. Well, I'm going to. So let me give you this endpoint as -9, 10, and the midpoint as 2, -6. Okay, so I have an endpoint and I have a midpoint. Now we can take that information and we can plug it into this equation and make our lives really complicated. Or how about we draw a picture to help us? So I would like everyone to draw a segment. It doesn't really matter how long it is. It's just a sketch. Now, I know the endpoint is -9, 10. And I know the midpoint is 2, -6. Right? At the very beginning of this lesson, you told me that if I have a line segment, the pieces from the endpoint to the midpoint and the midpoint to the endpoint are going to be the same. Right? That's the whole definition of a midpoint. So let's start with the x's. Now listen to my question carefully. How many units away is -9 from 2? 11. Right? -9 to 0 is 9, and then you add 2 more to give you 11. So I'm adding 11 to go from here to here, correct? Now let me show you another way to solve it if you didn't see that in your head. -9 plus something, right? I'm going to add something, and it's going to get me to 2. Right? I start at -9, I add something to it, and it gets me to 2. So if I want to find that something, I can add 9 to both sides, giving me x equals 11. You see what I did to solve that? If you can't see it in your head, some of you are going to be like, I got that, I don't need to write it down. But here's the actual math to do it. So if from this endpoint to the midpoint is 11 units, from the midpoint to the endpoint should also be 11 units. So what's 2 plus 11? 2 plus 11. 13.
How'd that take so long?
I don't know.
We're talking first and second grade here.
Okay? So let's do the same thing with the y's. So I want to go from 10 to -6. So I'm going backwards now, right? 10 to -6. So 10 plus something, I should make that a y, not an x. 10 plus something is going to give me -6. Okay, I'm going to subtract 10. I went backwards 16 units. So I'm going to go backwards. So here I subtracted 16. I'm going to subtract 16 again. What's -6 minus 16? -6 minus 16. -22. That's a little too advanced. I mean, I can use the formula and show you how much more complicated it is that way.
This is way more the easy way.
Okay, let's try another one. We'll do another one together. So here's my suggestion to you. If you cannot see how many units you're moving just by looking at it, then write it down. Whatever you start with plus something is going to equal the new thing. Okay? So let's look at the points. So my endpoint is going to be 3, -10, and my midpoint is going to be -1, 4. I also think it's easier to draw in the segment than to just try to figure it out, but if you don't need to draw the segment, then don't. Okay, you do you. So, do you want me to do it with you? Some of y'all are just going. You want me to do it, or you want to just try it? Do it? Okay. Okay, so I'm drawing my segment. I'm going to place my endpoint and my midpoint. So let's start with our x's. Okay, so my endpoint is 3. I'm going to add something to that to get me to what? -1. Right? So my endpoint is 3. I'm going to add something to it to get me to -1. Can we solve this equation? So I subtract 3 from both sides, giving me x equals -4. And again, since both of these are equal, I now have to add -4 to -1. What's -1 plus -4? -5. So really I subtracted 4 here, so I'm going to subtract 4 more here. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with y. I have -10. I'm going to add something to it to give me 4. How do I get y by itself? Add 10, which means you should end up with y equals 14. So from the y's, I added 14. So I'm going to add 14. 4 plus 14 is 18. You should have gotten -518 as your final answer. Kind of makes more sense? So let's try another one. Last one. Let's have an endpoint of -2, -3, and a midpoint of 4, 1. Okay, so take a second and I want you and or your group to figure out what that is. Okay, so if I'm solving for x, -2 plus something equals 4. And when I add that something, that should be a 2. Doing too much in my head. You get x equals 6. So 4 plus 6 gives me 10. Then the y's. -3 plus something equals 1. To find that something, I'm going to add 3 to both sides, which means y equals 4. And 1 plus 4 is 5. Okay? So just make sure when you're looking at it, you look at the x's individually and then the y's individually. Not too bad? Awesome. 4